Alrighty, so this is Chris once again recording for MagicGatheringStrat. So for this little segment, I'm going to talk about my Delver Blue deck, and, well, the main deck is still unchanged from Mezzel's Delver deck. I haven't seen Mezzel play in a while, but I imagine if he does play again, then he'll probably go back to this deck, because the main deck is just so strong that it's almost hard to go away from it once you get used to playing it like this. So let's start off with the land base. We've got 17 islands and 2 quicksands. And one of the things that I discussed in Pauper Walkthroughs is, like, quicksands, right? The quicksands are not always a land. They are, I mean, most of the time they are just straight up a land, but you gotta look at them as a kill spell more than a land, although they do incidentally provide you with that land. And these are sort of a mirror tech, mostly, for getting rid of opposing ninjas, and also you can incidentally just get rid of your, like, Stompy players, attackers, or goblin attackers, or whatever. I mean, quicksand's just a great early play, and it can also provide mana if you need mana. I'm not going to discuss Brainstorm just yet, but we're going to go with the creature base for now. Creature base, obviously we've got Delver's Secrets right here, and this is a guy that, you know, he pretty much defines the deck. And we also got another 1-drop here with Phantasmal Bear, and these guys are we only have 2 of these in the deck because they're not always good against every deck, and that's sort of what I was talking about before, where if a card isn't great against every deck, but it is very good against some decks, you kind of want to have these 2 ofs that they're great against some decks, and whenever you draw them, they're just really good, but they're a prime target to sideboard out. Then, you know, any blue deck playing any less than 4 counterspells, I think, is wrong. Unless you talk about mono blue Fissure Post, of course, but this is not mono blue Fissure Post. This is just blue fairies. So we've got our 4 counterspells here. I keep meaning to pick up another counterspell that matches, or picking up the matching counterspells, but for now I don't have them, so I'm not going to worry about it. And we got 4 snaps, and this is sort of what defines this archetype, because most mono blue decks are either playing 3 snaps. Well, yeah, most mono blue decks are playing 3 snaps right now, unless they're blue combo decks. But the 4 snaps is essential for providing control. And to make up for the 4 snaps, we have 2 excludes, which are going to provide us with. Normally, snap is card disadvantage because your opponent can just recast the creature. But if you factor in exclude, where you get to counter a creature spell and draw a card, it actually becomes card advantage. It becomes a card parity to snap a creature and then exclude it on the way back down, or spell starter it on the way back down. We've also got 4 Cloud of Fairies, and I think anything less than 4 Cloud of Fairies is wrong, because you really want to turn on your spell starter sprites. And spell starter sprites are your big tempo play, and you get a lot of cool tricks with spell starter sprite when you combine it with snap, right? You can snap your own spell starter sprite to recounter a spell, and that comes in quite a bit, actually. That little play comes in more often than you would imagine. We've got Luna's Grace, which is also another prime target to sideboard out, because sometimes it's just way too slow. But other times, it will provide you with never-ending card advantage. And once again, my mouse is removing cards from my deck. So let's re-add that. Una's. But in the meantime, we're going to talk about Ninja the Deep Hours, which is going to provide you with amazing synergy with Spell Starter Sprite. And occasionally, you just want to ninja out your Phantasmal Bear and start drawing extra cards. And Ninja becomes one of those threats that, like, they have to deal with, or you're just going to bury them in card advantage, all the while dealing them insane amounts of damage. And then you've got Gush, and I think Gush is a very underplayed card right now. It's just the instant speed, 0 mana, draw 2 cards. And this card is just insane. It also provides you with, if you miss a land drop, you can Gush and replay the land, so it's like you're only actually down 1 land sometimes when you cast Gush. And we've got Spire Golems. These guys are only 3 of in this deck, and some lists are playing 4. I don't fault those lists, but typically if you have more than 1 Spire Golem in your starting hand, you're like, it's practically a mulligan, right? Because ideally you can't cast Spire Golem until turn 4 when you have 4 islands on the board. So you can cast a Spire Golem and have counterspell protection. So that's why I'm only running 3 of them. And also we've got the Piracy Charms. I didn't talk about those too much, but those actually do provide you a bit of an edge against Stompy and Elves that you wouldn't necessarily normally have. So if you go turn 1 Island Go, leaving up a Piracy Charm, and your opponent plays a turn 1 Quirion Ranger or a turn 1 Llanowar Elves, you can Piracy Charm them, and a lot of the advantage they lost by being able to produce more mana is then... I mean, that's where they get a lot of their advantage, and that's where Stompy decks or Elf decks can really trounce a Delver. But if you can kill their turn 1 play, it becomes very, very good. And once again, going with our theory on cards that aren't always good, well, Piracy Charm isn't always good, but it's decent in any matchup. Even against like mono blue post or even blue red post, you can just make them discard a card, and it's like both of you mulligan to 6, and that's okay. And against these control decks that are really relying on bearing you in card advantage or temporal fissures, that you can just strip them of a card. That's sort of the price you pay for having like less than optimal decks or less than optimal cards in your main deck, is that sometimes like this Piracy Charm is going to give you an actual chance against Elves, but it is kind of bad against like the control decks, but it's okay enough against the other decks, and it provides you enough of an edge against the other decks that it's okay to have 3 of these in your main deck. So the card I said I'd come back to was Brainstorm. And Brainstorm, every time I stream or every time I make videos, people always comment that they hate Brainstorm in this deck. So what a lot of people aren't thinking of is Brainstorm is the most consistent way to flip your Delver. Ponder doesn't do as well as Brainstorm. Preordain doesn't do as well as Brainstorm. Serum Visions doesn't do as well as Brainstorm. Brainstorm is just the best way to flip your Delver. And if your opponent leads off with a Cloud Post, and you've led off with a turn 1 Delver, and your opponent leads off with a Cloud Post, you know that you need to immediately flip that Delver and get as much pressure on them as possible. And the best way to do that is during your upkeep, you Brainstorm, you stick an instant or sorcery on top, and you flip the Delver. You force flip the Delver at the cost of leaving Counterspell mana not up. It also does amazing things, like you're flooding out later on in the game, and you're just drawing island after island, and then you draw Brainstorm, and you can Brainstorm, stick those 2 islands on top, and whatever 3 cards you drew off the Brainstorm are now live cards in your hand. So, your Brainstorm could reveal something as simple as like a Counterspell, a Snap, and even just another island, but now you actually have 2 useful cards in your hand, whereas a Ponder or Preordain would have only gotten 1 of those cards and left another one on top. And Brainstorm also has the incidental use of, if your opponent is duressing you, then you can hide your instants or sorceries from them so that the duress fails. I had that happen once to me in the last Delver Daily event that I went over, where my opponent duressed me, and I was able to hide like a Snap and a Counterspell, and he discarded Nuna's Grace, which really was not very good for him when he discarded my Nuna's Grace. Because I don't care if Nuna's Grace is in the graveyard, I can just recast it at any given point in time. So Brainstorm is just insane in this type of deck, especially when you always want to leave open Counterspell mana, and it's like you're playing as a mono black control deck or something, and you cast a Delver, but they don't have a turn 2 play. You can leave open Brainstorm, so they either have to play something directly into your Spellstutter Sprite or your Counterspell, or if they don't, then you can just Brainstorm at the end of the turn and make that Delver flip, or make your hand better. So that's why I like Brainstorm. Sometimes, though, you do get kind of screwed by Brainstorm. Sometimes you're stuck on lands, and your top 3 cards are just not lands, and you just bury yourself with a Brainstorm. But that happens so infrequently that, and Brainstorm is so much better in so many other situations, that I'm just willing to go with Brainstorm here, even if it is by itself not as good with no shuffle effects, but the card is just crazy powerful on its own, that it's just so powerful on its own that I just don't mind playing 4 of these instead of the 4 Ponders or Preordains. The other thing is, every card in this deck is powerful, right? At pretty much any given point in the game. You can always cycle your Cloud of Fairies. Your Spellstutter Sprites are always worth at least a counterspell to your opponent's like Preordains or whatever. And it's like you're never drawing into dead cards with Brainstorm, whereas with Ponder and Preordain, sometimes you want to stick the late game Dazes on the bottom, or stick your late game whatever on the bottom, or shuffle your library because Ponder doesn't give you anything. And every single card in this deck is just powerful on its own. Sometimes you're brainstorming into a Gush. Sometimes you're brainstorming into a Ninja you desperately need to draw even more cards, or even Exclude, or a Snap, or so Brainstorm's like, it's always live, and you're always getting good cards, right? You don't ever need to pitch anything to the bottom. So that's my little spiel on Brainstorm here, and heck, even if you brainstorm to a couple lands, Eo's Grace is going to let you draw more cards. So I'm going to go to the sideboard now, and in the sideboard I'm going to discuss, obviously Full Hydroblast is good against any red-based deck, and most red-based decks are running Pyroblast in the sideboard, so most of the time you're going to bring the Hydroblast just to counter their Pyroblasts. It's also good at just killing Fiends or Nivik Cyclopses from the blue-red Cyclops Fiend deck. We've got Boomerangs, which I'm actually kind of less impressed with Boomerang here recently. Boomerang's mainly a tempo play used against decks that are running Karu lands or Cloudpost as their mana-generating engines. It's a very, very niche case, and it's only good on these tempo plays. And you're bringing in Boomerangs basically in place of Piracy Charms, because the Piracy Charms aren't as good against these Cloudpost decks as just bouncing their land and setting them back on land drops a turn. Like, they're still fine. Like, the Piracy Charms are still okay, but Boomerangs are just better in that matchup. And you've got Deprives is just a hard counterspell. Also works really well with Luna's Grace and the matchups that you're bringing in Deprive in. And the Fairy Trickery, which is used basically just to counter Mystical Teachings from the blue-red Cloudpost deck. And I discussed a little bit about how Affinity has so much various sideboard hate for it. We don't opt for any direct sideboard hate here against Affinity. Our sideboard hate is in the form of the Snake Forms. And the Snake Forms are just a crazy good tempo play against Affinity, because you get to kill their thing, you get to draw a card. I mean, their full force become a 1/1 until end of turn. You get to draw a card, you get to chump block, even if you just block it with a Cloud of Fairies. You're blocking their Mirror Enforcer with a Cloud of Fairies, you trade there, and you get to replace your Cloud of Fairies with something more useful, such as a Snap or a Ninja or a Spire Golem or whatever. So that's our hate for Affinity, but most of the time against Affinity, provided they don't have the God Draw, if you Spell Starter the Carapace Forgers and Atogs, if you Hydroblast the Atog or the Galvanic Blast or whatever, then you pretty much win the game. I've got a pretty good matchup against Affinity. I like to think that that's because this is a good deck against Affinity. It has a much better matchup than the Daze-based Delvers decks do. But it could just be because I'm a good player and I've come up against bad Affinity players. But that's neither here nor there. We also have in the sideboard a Singleton Stitch Drake, and Stitch Drake is really good against Goblins decks or Stompy decks. Basically, it's like a Spire Golem number 4, because the Spire Golems are really the way that you beat those kinds of decks. You lay down a Spire Golem to hold off their attacks, and you beat down with a Flip Delver. And then you've got Serrated Arrows for also pretty much the same matchups. You've got the arrows will come in against Goblins or Stompy decks as just ways to kill their excess creatures. Serrated Arrows also combines pretty well as Piracy Charm for killing 2 toughness guys, such as like Mog Conscripts or whatever. Or opposing Nettle Sentinels. You can arrow it down, Piracy Charm it, and you kill them, and you still have 2 arrowhead counters left to use. So that's the Delver deck. The other choice that you could have instead of Snake Forms for Affinity matchup is Steel Sabotage. And Steel Sabotage is okay. Like, it's an unsummon against their Mirror Enforcers if the Mirror Enforcers are on the table, or it's just a 1-mana counterspell for the Mirror Enforcers. I think this is too narrow of a card, whereas Snake Form can be brought in against opposing Delver decks as well, as ways to kill off their Spire Golem or Delvers or whatever. So I like Snake Form because it's got a little bit more versatility than Steel Sabotage, because it is also useful in the mirror matchups, and it's also incidentally useful against things like Ulamog's Crusher, although I'll never bring in Snake Form against a deck that uses Ulamog's Crusher unless it's like mono green Cloudpost or something. The Snake Form is a very good tech against Affinity, and I was kind of surprised a lot of decks aren't using this more. I kind of thought this would catch on once I started posting some more results, but it hasn't yet. But I'm okay with that. I'm okay with other decks not catching on to the snake form tech. It's worked out very, very well for me, and that's why I use it. And I think it's enough of a discussion against the deck, so let me know what you think in the comments on this YouTube video if when it's posted. And if you have a more compelling argument for why I should be running things, include what I would take out in place of these things. And my sideboard plan's been posted a few times as to how I sideboard. The only thing I'm really not too sure of at the moment, as far as the deck goes, is actually the boomerangs. As good as it has been, sometimes I feel like I just don't need it against those types of decks. So let me know what you think. That would be pretty much the only card that I would be looking at cutting or replacing in this current meta. Although it is still very, very good. When it's good, it's insanely good, and it just wins you the game. When it's bad, it's really bad, though. So, alright, well, this is Chris, recording for MagicGatheringStrat. Thank you guys for watching.